What was your family secret that you found out? My nana was kidnapped when she was in her teens, and the only reason she wasn't great murdered is because she jumped out of a moving van. She basically destroyed both her knees and has since had multiple surgeries. Still needs to wear braces and use a cane, but my nana is dope as duck. Edit. Spelling. I went full dumb. My uncle is older than my mom. And when they were kids he would tease her incessantly that she was adopted. She was pretty scarred by that, and other older brother terrorist antics. I don't know the details. But he was registering for something when he was around 60 years old and needed his birth certificate, and either lost his or never had one. He went to the local courthouse where he found out he was adopted. His adoptive parents, my mom's parents, were both dead by then, so he couldn't ask them all the questions he had. My uncle died suddenly of a heart attack at a strip club after a private dance, and the stripper was a nursing student who performed CPR on him for a while until paramedics arrived. My grandfather, who I had a high opinion of. I grew up thinking he was awesome all throughout my childhood, as kids do. As I got older I noticed that my older siblings didn't really talk about him, and there was definitely some hidden discourse regarding him. I never put that much though into it. That is until I graduated high school and spent New Year's with 2 of my siblings. Turns out he abused 3 of my oldest sisters. Duck that guy. Great-grandfather was a federal judge and also a successful bootlegger. One of the cowboys who had worked on our family's ranch used to joke that the reason he never got fired in the 40+ years he worked for us was because he knew where on the ranch some rival bootleggers are buried. I always thought he was joking until a few years ago while going through some old oil leases I found a letter forbidding any drilling, test or otherwise, or road work on a particular half section of the ranch. Me. In a way. Or who my dad was. Depending on how you look at it. The details would take a pretty long while to type out. But essentially, my mom hid me from my dad and told me my entire life that he was dead before I was born, to prevent me looking into it. She made up a random guy, provided pictures of him, but never of my mom with him, gave a story on how he died, and I spent 20 years never thinking to question it. Apparently my dad and my grandmother would find ways to try and contact me, but my mom and my grandma on mom's side would shut it down and threaten them if they did. Whole thing is crazy. At 20 my dad found me on Facebook and told me the whole story, providing pictures of the 2 of us together when I was barely a toddler, as well as pictures of him with my mom. Apparently they had a falling out and my mom wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. My dad and I are very cool now. The whole story is absolutely heartbreaking, especially for my dad's mom. She wanted to get to know me so desperately, and only did in the last 2 years she was alive. My dad and I text once a week, and it's pretty grand when it happens. My step-great-grandfather and great-grandmother never actually married. They put on a fake ceremony of sorts but didn't legally wed so she could continue getting her deceased husband's social security, life insurance, etc. Didn't find out until great-grandma died. They had lived together for around 20 years. My mother's sister got kicked out of the house when she was 14 because she was stealing from her parents. When you're poor and one of 7 children. Yeah, you don't do that. Anyway, she soon gets pregnant and has the baby at 15. Gives it up for adoption. That's not the family secret, though. She finds and marries a guy in his 40s when she's 18. And the guy has several children, the oldest of whom are around her age. She stays with this man for over 20 years and has a few kids with him. Then one day, she decides to run away with his daughter. My aunt and her stepdaughter, who is her age, have been together now since I was a very small child. Edit. Oh. And my aunt is still legally married to her ex. Hasn't seen him in years though. I did a 23andMe kit and matched with a guy a little younger than I am as first cousins. Absolutely nobody in my family knew my uncle had fathered a child after he and his first wife divorced. My uncle has been dead almost 20 years. But his twin daughters have since met their half-brother and he is getting to know our entire massive family. This is so exciting. My fiancé just did his 23andMe kit. His father was adopted and has spent years and thousands of dollars to find his parents, but we still have no clue. Here's hoping we find a mystery relative. Somewhere out there has to be someone. That my uncle is my cousin. He was born to my aunt and adopted by my grandparents and raised as her brother. According to my mom, my aunt threatened to kill herself if she had to have the baby and raise it herself. It being the late 60s, they adopted the baby. Then a few years later she got pregnant again and pulled the same thing, but this time my grandparents wouldn't adopt that baby. My uncle and cousin don't know they are actually half brothers. Turns out I have a black uncle. Didn't find out until my grandmother told my aunt in a semi-lucid moment while she was bedridden. No. It's not what you think. When my father was a kid, his family employed a black housekeeper, maid servant, whatever you call it, who was around 16 or 17. My dad recalls that sometimes she'd bring her little brother to come by and play with my dad and his siblings. Then something happened. Apparently things were bad at home. Or maybe the parents got in a car wreck. I think it was more the former. But I don't recall. Anyway. While the daughter was old enough to become emancipated, she wasn't going to be allowed to take custody of her younger brother and he was going to be put into foster care. So my grandfather called his lawyer friend and very quietly adopted the boy so that he could continue living with his sister. Keep in mind my grandfather was a doctor. And this was a small town in the rural south during the 1950s-1960s. It likely would have been somewhat significantly damaging to his reputation had this been made public, hence the secrecy. Anyway. Never met the guy. Family hardly knows anything about him. Though I know he has a family and is doing alright. So yeah. I have a black uncle. And my grandmother missed taking that secret to her grave by just a few months. My French grandmother was in love with a German soldier when she was a teenager in occupied France. He died at the front. But I found some old love letters he wrote her when we cleaned her apartment after she recently passed away. My mother was sexually abused by her father as a child. She ended up suffering severe mental health problems, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, and developed a dependency on drugs such as benzodiazepines, marijuana, and a handful of others. She committed suicide at the age of 52. I was 15 at the time. It was only about a year after her death that I found out a lot of her issues in life stemmed from the fact her father sexually abused her and one of her siblings, who also took her own life at the age of 30. My mom led such a troubled life. And I always wonder what sort of person she would have been if things had been more stable. Mom, I miss you each and every day. Aunt put a hit out on my uncle back in the Philippines. Hitman was my uncle's friend though. Hey bro, your wife paid me to heal you. Wanna leave her and go get some drinks with all this money? My gram had a baby that nobody never knew about. As she was dying, she kept asking for her baby. And afterwards we found a single photo of a baby that isn't any of our family. Then my uncle told us she went away for a summer when she was a young adult and it kind of clicked. Heartbreaking. Her parents were really strict and we suspect she didn't have a choice in the matter. My grandpa is probably wanted for something serious in his country of birth. He was born in Armenia sometime prior to WW2. He refuses to explain why, but he ended up in France under somewhat murky circumstances. He joined the French Foreign Legion under a fake name. His real first name is totally unknown to anyone that is alive anymore. The last person who knew was my grandma, who died about 10 years ago. One of the last things she said to me was, I never did like the fact he picked Jake as his name. He was wounded during the war in Indochina and received French citizenship. A clause in the Legion's contract states if you get wounded in the service of France you get citizenship, and got his papers in his assumed name. Fast forward until I am in my early 20s and in the military and stationed in Europe. I ask him if we have any family members still living in Armenia so I could visit them. He insists I never go there or ever try to contact any of them. He died last year. Copying this from another post I commented on. Too long to type out again. In the early 1900s, my great-grandparents immigrated to the US from Italy. They lived in southern Illinois. Great-grandfather working in coal mines and great-grandmother being a stay-at-home mom. They had 3 children. 2 boys and a girl. The youngest child being my grandfather. His brother, my great-uncle, was always said to be tall, thick build, a temper and a love of adventure. When my grandfather was still young, if I remember correctly, under the age of 10 his brother went missing. This was really no cause for concern in the first couple weeks, for he would occasionally hop on a train and take off to Chicago or St. Louis just to see the city. Usually he'd be gone for a week or 2 and then show back up. After close to a month they knew something was wrong. But no one knew where to look. There was no Amber Alerts or missing persons network to tap into. All they could do was wait and hope he would come back. A couple months later a letter showed up. Not in the mail but nailed to the front door. It was from a group called the Black Hand. They had my great uncle. They demanded a ransom. I do not know how much. But being a poor coal mining family there was nothing they could do. It broke them. My great aunt had a breakdown and spent the rest of her life in an institute. Both of my great grandparents turned to alcohol. My grandfather would retreat to the woods to be alone, which eventually earned him the nickname Jungle. My grandfather told me this story once. He never looked at me the entire time he spoke. I knew he never told anyone this story besides his wife. My mother and her 2 sisters never heard this story until I told them after my grandparents had passed. They never knew they had an uncle, let alone one who was taken by this group. I haven't thought about that story for a long time now. Probably close to 20 years. I wonder. And I know my grandfather always did. What became of his brother? How did he get caught up with them? Was he a part of the Black Hand or just another victim? An old family question that will forever be unanswered. My aunt got pregnant at 15 and dropped out of high school to have the baby. She gave him up for adoption. My cousins, her children from her marriage 10 years later, don't know they have a half brother somewhere out there. She died a few years ago and now they will never know unless he shows up for some reason. I keep waiting for a phone call from my cousin asking if I know anything. Apparently my grandpa blamed my dad for not protecting my aunt and keeping her out of trouble, and it really messed him up. That resulted in him having a really hard time dealing when my older sister started going down the same path as my aunt. My mom's brother has an illegitimate child in Thailand. My mom's oldest brother and her father sexually abused her and her sisters. My relative killed a person in a car accident. He's a judge though, so he managed to bury the case. Well, duck him for abusing his power. My dad recently confessed to my sister and I that he likes to dress up as a woman and go out to bars with other men who enjoy the same thing. He even showed me pictures of himself. It's been bizarre to fully digest it all because it really never occurred to me, but I'm actually very relieved that he does that, since I thought he was very lonely and didn't have any friends. He went through a divorce, the death of both of his parents, and his company went bankrupt in the span of 3 years and became very depressed at one point. Which I'm pretty sure is what led him to go look for something else in life. I've been a very complicated son and our relationship hasn't been the best lately, but I'm very happy that he found a place to feel comfortable in and that he found strength to confide in my sister and myself. I'm also very happy that he knows he'll never be judged by us for the things he likes to do. Edit. Thank you all for the comments, guys. I appreciate it a lot. I did mention RuPaul's show to him when we talked about it, so there's that. A friend of my dad committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in front of my dad and some friends when they were 16. I found out because my mom told me about it when I was like 18 or 19. But I never wanted to pry about it and wanted him to talk about it with me when he wanted to. Which he finally did this past Christmas. It definitely explained an incident when I was a kid. My friend and I were playing on my porch with cap guns that looked pretty realistic. My dad saw us pointing these at each other and flipped out, grabbing mine and smashing it on the wall. I was so confused about that. But after I found out, it made a lot of sense. Seeing his son playing with the gum and pointing it at someone else must have triggered some memory of that day. My dad wrote us a letter the night before he died on his laptop saying he was gay and so sorry and he felt like this was his end. We found it after he had passed while going through his things. Parents were still married at the time. 24 years. But my mom said it just finally made all the pieces click. And explained a lot of his weird behavior. She still has a thing against most men and thinks they're all secretly gay though. Me and my mom have kept it a secret. And never told any other family members, only child here. But maybe one day down the line after my mom passes, I wouldn't be opposed to letting some of his brothers and sisters know. Especially since his sister is gay as well. And she never handled it the best. But I know it's super shameful for my mom. So I won't ever mention it where it will come back to her. At age 31 found out I had a sister, given up for adoption and raised by another family, that the family was all ashamed of and had erased from the family history. Guess what? She's awesome and my brother and I are really close to her now. And she's had a good life. Everybody won in the end more or less, just hurts to think about all the years we missed. Equals. My grandpa was an abusive drunk and my grandma took the kids and ran for the hills. Also, something my mother said during an argument with my father. She didn't finish the sentence. But all I heard was, "Do you want me to tell them? The night you came home drunk and your mom was there? Maybe I'm better off not knowing." Edit, for clarification. This is two different grandmas that I'm referring to. My grandpa served in World War II in the Pacific Theater. I'm not sure what he was rank-wise though. He was very closed about talking about the war or even his family growing up. Every now and again he would open up about things, but it was one of those random things. He's 98 years old, so I can't even begin to imagine what he has gone through. One day my parents and my uncle was visiting him in the nursing home and he mentioned something about the war. My dad always tries to see what he can get out of him, and after pushing he found out that he was taken prisoner by the Japanese. He said the only reason he escaped was by pure chance. I can't begin to imagine what that was like or what he went through. Edit, I woke up this morning and remembered how the conversation was started. My dad was saying his goodbyes for the day and he asked him if he wanted him to turn his lamp off. My grandfather said no because he didn't like being in the dark. When my dad asked him why, he said when I was captured during the war he was held inside a room with no light except a tiny pinhole. This was the first time my dad or my uncle had known that. My grandpa found out he has a brother after being over 80 years old. I forgot exactly how it happened, but it was one of those small world coincidences. Turns out they have the same name and look almost identical even now. My grandmother was great when she was only 17 years old. We talked about it and she just said he had his way with her like it was just something that happened. Until this date my grandmother doesn't quite understand that she was raped. She doesn't talk about it, but she says that those few months that she lives with her rapist were a blur to her until she left to return back home. When I was 6, I asked my dad why he chewed so weird. This is an early memory. But I remember he looked at me with a cross between shut up and how did you see that, because of something he had never told us or my mom, who he was married to for 13 years. And who was sitting at that same dinner table that night. This was in 1986. They divorced in 1987 for unrelated reasons. She died in 2010. I noticed he was missing some teeth this year, 2018, and mentioned he should get dentures. He informed me he's had full dentures since he was 20. And my mom and us kids never knew. And I'm 38 now. My sister I think still doesn't. And she's 35. My dad lost almost all his teeth due to being raised by a mom, my grandma, who didn't care or take care of him. He only had the 4 front bottom teeth by age 20. And his dentures don't fit now. Which is how I noticed the missing teeth. My mom had a child before me that she put up for adoption. I found out when he reached out to me and was shocked that I had no idea who he was. Nobody knows that I know and they are hiding it from me. The only difference is now I notice that my aunt will make a small slip when she's drunk. Says things like before your mom had babies. Even though I'm an only child, then quickly corrects herself. I should use a throwaway because this is still a secret. But I doubt anyone who cares is on Reddit. I always thought my dad was the model husband who would never cheat. He was a strict Catholic. And a pillar in the community. My friends and I used to joke about how dorky and chaste he was. He would never even look at another woman. Turns out, it's because he was gay. I found out when I caught him watching gay porn. And later found big dick pics and texts with young men. Offering them money or concert tickets. Suddenly my entire life made sense. Why he was never interested in any other women. Why he didn't care for sports. And loved theater and the opera and had close mentorships with young men. I was furious at his having kept this secret and hurting my mom this way. So I confronted him about it in front of my mother. Which I regret doing. I was young and confrontational, and it caused a rift in our relationship. They stayed together. But their relationship was never the same. Both he and my mom have passed away. Both from illness in their early 60s. He stood by my mother's bedside every waking moment until she died. And passed away himself less than 2 years later. I know he loved her. I understand why he kept his sexuality a secret. When he was in his last days, unconscious in the hospital, I flew to be by his side. I asked for forgiveness and told him that I loved and accepted him for who he was. I hope he heard me. He was a great dad. I miss them both terribly. My grandfather hid gold Austro-Hungarian coins from socialist Yugoslav tax collectors. We didn't find out until he passed away. He could have been jailed for that back in the day. But now it's cool because I get to inherit a really awesome coin. My parents divorced 35 years ago after being together for 3 years only. I've been through a duck in hell being between them. Absolute bullshit. Being part of their fights and disputes. I'm 36 and still having issues with them. Especially my mom. Turns out they still saw each other for like 15 years after divorced. Couple of selfish bricks. But it's my fault for not cutting ties with them. My nephew, Skylar, was actually born my niece, Skylar. This was kept secret from the family until the kid was visiting my parents, their grandparents, at 9. And woke up screaming due to blood in their sheets. After having a talk with Skylar, my sister and her husband picked them up and cut off communication. We have no idea why Skylar was raised like this and haven't been able to contact anyone about it. Apparently, my grandfather slept around on my grandma a lot. And just last night, I found out my grandma was gangster as hell. She went to the mistress's house and shot it up. With grandkids in the backseat. Grandpa was a plier and grandma was a gangster. My bio father is responsible for a slew of home invasions that took place in the deep south sometime before I was born. He's a semi-large drug dealer, nowhere near cartel levels, that stole valuables from homes when his drug running wasn't paying the bills. He was nabbed on a domestic violence charge. Served his time. Immediately robbed a few houses and ducked off somewhere outside the US. I have no idea where he is, but I hope if he ever returns to the US he is somehow caught for his remaining crimes. My brother is only my half brother. I don't know why I was never told. My sis knew. She is 4 years older than me. Bro is 10 years older. Apparently my mom got knocked up by a real cuntbag. Met my dad while pregnant. Stuck it out. I actually know the guy who is his dad. He's proper scum. The entire family is. Bunch of thieves and bagheads. My bro is a lot like his dad and that family. It's weird because they've never been around. It makes me think being a hunt is hereditary, huh? An old lady once paid my dad $4,600 and he accepted to keep our family from going homeless. My mom only found out because the lady's family wanted to sue him. And my mom almost left him over it. She told me about 10 years later. He knows I know. But we don't talk about it. I still think my dad did the right thing. and would do the same thing if I was in his position. My uncle and his wife had basically stolen tens of thousands of dollars from my grandma. They would apparently make up stories about how they needed it to cover rent or whatever, and would come to her for money pretty frequently. 1,000 there, a few hundred there, it added up real quick. And poor grandma was getting kinda senile, so she always believed them and didn't remember when she'd already given them money. They then turned around and used it on Drew Gus. By the time my mom and her other siblings realized what was going on, they had taken over $50,000 from her over the course of a few years. When they realized everyone knew, they skipped town one day. Completely sudden. And we haven't heard from them in 10 years.